From packaged seafood to ice cream and beverage drinks, a major part of our diets include foods that need to be refrigerated. But since the Amish don't use typical refrigeration systems, they've come up with other ways to keep food chilled. So let's check out what those methods are. Right off the bat, you'd agree with us that there are a lot of things that are hard to relate to concerning the Amish way of life. We mean wearing only 3 or 4 dull colors of clothing regardless of the occasion or season. That's something that'll have any fashionista deeply worried. How about having to live countless miles away from civilization and everything that counts as a symbol of technological advancement in this modern age? That's definitely not something you'd randomly decide to do for the entirety of your life. But perhaps the most unrelatable part of Amish living is the off-grid rule that requires all members of the Amish community to live without sourcing electric power from the public national electricity grid. Between you and us, there are clearly a lot of things that make the idea of life without an electric power supply impossible to bear. But one of the most concerning aspects is not being able to have a refrigerator or a freezer in your home. It's the 21st century, and quite frankly, home refrigerators have been designed for over a century now. The early generations of the Amish culture probably found it easy to rule out the use of electricity as a rule because back then, in the early 1900s, refrigerators in homes were not really a thing. But today, the use of a cooling system for foodstuffs can't be overlooked. There's the obvious role of refrigerators being used to preserve foods, but if you've checked out our other videos, you'd know that the Amish have that covered. Since they don't have cooling devices in their homes, they've come up with a ton of different ways to preserve all manner of dishes and foodstuff for even longer than any refrigerator can. However, when it comes to the part of foods that necessarily need to be kept cool or served chilled, you'd struggle to come up with any other way to achieve that aim except through the use of a refrigerator. That's the thing about being Amish though. They might have to live far away from civilization, but they always find a way to achieve anything modern people can, even without all the technological devices. The basis of every Amish food cooling technique lies in their core values of self-sufficiency, community, and sustainability. The idea of being self-sufficient is why the Amish don't use refrigerators in the first place. They'd much rather make use of the things readily available in their environment than sourcing for help from the more technologically advanced. In the case of community being a core value, the Amish try to implement methods that bring unity into their settlement and encourage shared activities. As you'll soon see, a number of traditional Amish food cooling techniques require members of a community coming together to put it into place for the betterment of everyone. This might seem a bit circumstantial, but the Amish put great value on being able to achieve things together as a group. That's why they'll all rather come up with methods to keep food chilled than one individual having a refrigerator and the others being left out. As for sustainability, it's pretty easy. The Amish don't apply any practices that can knowingly harm the environment or nature. Never. The only methods they approve of are sustainable and renewable to ensure they never harm Mother Nature. It's just who they are. Because of these values, the Amish have mastered the act of humidity control to keep foodstuffs cold and chilled. That probably sounds like they have some divine element manipulation abilities, but it's a lot more basic than that. By mastering humidity control, the Amish are able to be continually aware of the shifting humidity around their settlement. This enables them to plan their cooling methods and occasions, ensuring they don't expose food to too much moisture to avoid mold and also don't subject it to too much dryness to prevent it getting dry. And when that's out of the way, the next most important thing to consider in Amish cooling methods is how to maximize the environment. By leveraging natural sources of coolness like flowing water and cold winds, the Amish ensure they don't need refrigeration to get food cold or chilled. To explain the Amish environment optimization, we'll be looking at the most common way by which the Amish keep foods cold, the root cellar. Have you ever heard of a root cellar before or been in one? Whatever the design or setup of the root cellar you're familiar with, you should know there's no more efficient design than that used by the Amish. Unlike most other food preservation techniques used by the Amish, like canning, pickling, and dehydrating, which require reducing food items into smaller pieces, root cellaring allows for storage without any processing. Sounds quite like how you'd store food in a cold room, and perhaps that's the best way to describe a root cellar, especially as the Earth's refrigerator. It is a space mapped out below normal ground level, solely to keep foods cool. Typically, root cellars are built in the basement of houses, but for the Amish, it can be anywhere else, including beneath a homestead, near the family home, or even in the hillsides near their farms. Whatever location is used to design a root cellar, the Amish ensure it's deep enough in the ground and easily accessible. The depth into the ground helps to keep more advantage of the Earth's insulating ability, which is basically what keeps food materials cold in a root cellar. And the most fascinating part about root cellars is that just like they keep food cool during the summer, root cellars also have the ability to keep food warm during the winter, or at least warm enough to prevent freezing. Sounds crazy, sure, but basically, root cellars work on the natural technology of countering the weather temperature above ground level. When it's cold up there, it's warm down there. And when it gets really hot up there, it also gets really cool down there. Sure, that sounds like just digging a well and storing food in it. There's a lot more details the Amish take note of to get an effective and purpose-serving root cellar. One of which is to monitor the temperature of the cellar at intervals. Generally, the temperature of root cellars are somewhere between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But during the summer, in some really hot settlements, it can get as high as 60 degrees. But all of these temperatures are good enough to keep food in good condition. Anything closer to freezing point or closer to 70 degrees, however, is either too hot or too cold. So the Amish sometimes have a thermometer in their cellars to measure the temperature at intervals to ensure it remains within the right range. Anything towards the extremes could damage foodstuff faster and lead to decay. The Amish then make efforts to ensure high humidity in their root cellars by flooring the cellars with gravel or dirt. These materials maintain higher humidity and prevent foods from getting limp due to water loss. Another important tip from the Amish root cellaring handbooks is to make sure to block out all the lights from your cellar. Basically, it's difficult to have a fully functional cooling system when there's a lot of lighting in it. That's why your home refrigerator bulb goes off as soon as you try closing it. Light generates heat, which defeats the purpose of storing food in a root cellar, so they make sure they use burlap or other drapes to block excess light from coming in. For tuber foods like potatoes, the Amish directly lay a piece of burlap over a number of tubers to prevent sprouting. And that's not all of the Amish hacks to maximize the use of root cellars. They also ensure to boost ventilation in the root cellars by adding maybe a pipe or two to small root cellar barrels, or better still, they lay the walls of the cellar with wool and make holes around the wall. That way they can prevent too much or too little humidity and keep the room well ventilated. When all that is done, and the root cellar room has been prepared well enough, the next thing the Amish consider is how to keep the food products. We'll explain. Firstly, not every food item can be stored in a root cellar to keep it cool. The most advisable items are sturdy or thick-skinned crops like apples, pears, carrots, turnips, parsnips, beets, pumpkins, potatoes, and heading cabbages. The Amish also preserve canned foods, pickled food, and packaged beverages like wine in root cellars to keep them cool and durable. That's not to say delicate fruit and vegetables like leafy greens and berries can't be stored in root cellars, but they won't last as many months like the other foods. Being aware of this, the Amish make sure only to keep only unwashed and undamaged food items in a root cellar. If you're going to be trying out new root cellaring, there is something very vital to pay attention to. One damaged food item can affect all the other goods in the cellar. Excess moisture from a cut in fruit or water used to wash a piece of vegetable will only make it easier for mold and mildew to grow in your root cellar. Essentially, the best way to store most items is to keep them in the cellar exactly the way they were harvested. However, items like carrots and beets greens might need a little snipping at the edges before storing. Certain vegetables like garlic, onions, and squash can be cured to seal any scratch on their surface before putting them in the cellar. Winter radishes and carrots also last longer if you store them in moist sand, so the Amish put this into consideration when arranging items in their root cellar. Speaking of arrangements, root crops are stored horizontally or vertically in sturdy boxes or food-safe plastic buckets. The Amish also separate fruits and vegetables because certain fruits like apples and pears release ethylene gas, which makes vegetables in close proximity become overly ripe in very little time. You can't exactly see the gas seeping out of the fruits, so the best way to store them is to wrap them in sheets of paper and keep them as far away from delicate vegetables in the root cellar. You might be wondering, how do the Amish manage to remember all this key information to get the best out of root cellars in food cooling and preservation? Well, just like we mentioned earlier, the use of root cellars, like almost every Amish food preservation and storage method, can be passed down for many generations. So basically, Amish adults today grew up watching their parents and grandparents carry out these practices, and now it's more of a routine than anything else. But hey, you're not Amish, so if you'll be practicing the root cellar method, you might want to rewatch this video and probably take down notes to make sure your food items stay fresh and cool for as long as they should. Moving on, let's check out another remarkable Amish food cooling technique, ice housing. The first thing that probably comes to mind when you hear that term is the igloo Alaskans live in. But that's not quite what the Amish have in mind when they make their ice houses. Rather, the Amish ice house is a small structure built near their homes with bricks for proper insulation. So far, that's just a house, right? Well, here's the cool part. The Amish ensure to finish the construction of their ice houses way before the winter hits, because as soon as the cold rolls in, they literally go out and harvest massive chunks of ice, which they then keep in the ice house. As an easy way to picture an Amish ice house is to imagine a cooling room, only this time the cold isn't generated electrically. Instead, it's generated by just stuffing up the room with blocks of ice. In most Amish settlements in and around the United States, their location is far away from civilization. Busy roads and machinery result in them experiencing much more extreme weather conditions. During the summer, the heat hits harder around an Amish settlement than you'd feel it in the heart of a developed city. The same goes for the cold during the winter. As a result, most water bodies around an Amish settlement, like ponds, go completely frozen during the winter. And by that, we're not talking about just the surface being frozen enough to skate on. Not at all. These ponds get frozen for a considerable depth, so there's more than enough ice to cart away into ice houses. To give you an exact idea of how much ice can be gotten during the winter, an entire Amish settlement can get enough ice from just one medium-sized pond. Just like we've explained, the Amish value community bonding and unity, so much that the ice harvesting process is more of a festival than just a chore. Most times there's food, music, and storytelling done as part of the ice harvest in Amish communities. Families and members of the same settlement gather together around an ice pond. The men make use of chainsaws to ensure the ice is safe, after which they use homemade ice saws to cut the ice into blocks. Then the women and children use clamps to load the blocks onto trolleys and wagons and pull it into their homesteads. Having done that, all that's left is to unload the blocks of ice and strategically arrange them in the ice house. A century or two ago, this process wasn't peculiar to the Amish alone, as it was popular in America and in Europe before modern refrigeration devices came into existence. But since the Amish don't exactly support the use of such devices, they still practice ice housing till date. Ice houses are constructed with proper drainage systems for when the ice begins to melt, but are also insulated to ensure that the blocks of ice stay frozen for much longer than you'd expect. How much longer, you may ask? Well, difficult as it might be to believe, in some Amish settlements around the world, ice houses last all year round. Oh yeah, you heard that right. In places where the summer doesn't get too hot and where sufficient blocks of ice can be harvested, the Amish are able to keep these ice houses fully functional from one winter to another. The main secret behind this is the extent of insulation laid into each ice house. Rather than make use of foam like you'd find in your electrical or gas-powered refrigerators, the Amish make use of straw and sawdust to lay the interior walls of the ice house with. Remember, the walls are originally made from brick and stone, which in themselves have high insulating abilities, so adding straw and sawdust just makes it a lot more efficient. The Amish books might not state it with such modern terms, but these sects of people in their study and understanding of natural phenomena are aware of the high latent heat of fusion possessed by the harvested blocks of ice. This latent heat is responsible for ice being able to absorb a lot of heat just as it melts to ensure that the melting process remains cool enough to keep food items in perfect condition. As for the special tips and hacks implemented by the Amish to get the best out of their cooling techniques, the use of ice houses is pretty basic. The only thing worth noting is the meticulously designed drainage systems in the ice house to make sure that the water flows out as soon as it melts. This way the water doesn't form into a pool that makes the remaining ice melt faster. Instead, it all flows out and leaves solid ice still as durable as it should be. These structures are fit for keeping literally every and any food item that the Amish need to keep below room temperature. Vegetables, fruits, canned foods, beverages, literally anything you'd put in your refrigerator at home can go into the ice house. Much like these, the Amish also have spring houses as another ingenious food cooling method used by the Amish. The basic concept is quite similar to ice houses, but there are some differences to be considered. For spring houses, the Amish build a similar structure to an ice house, but this time it's not just situated near their homes. Instead, the building is constructed over a flowing spring. It's probably not news to you that spring water maintains a cool temperature all year round, regardless of how hot the summer gets, and they get even colder during the winter. Instead of the building, there are really low shelves fixed to the walls on which food items can be arranged. The shelves are placed lowly enough for the water from the spring to have contact with the food items. This way, the cold water absorbs heat from the stored items, keeping the temperature lower than the surrounding air. Spring houses offer an additional advantage of reducing the risk of spoilage of food as a result of the continuous water flow. The Amish prefer to store items like milk and other dairy products to maximize the effect of the coolness of fresh spring water. As far as eco-friendly and sustainable food cooling techniques go, it's hard to think of one better than spring houses. And although these methods used to be generally used around the world before modern home refrigeration devices hit the market, the Amish have done well to keep these traditions alive while still abiding by their core values. That's all for this video on how Amish keep food chilled without refrigeration. Which of these methods do you think is the most innovative? Let us know in the comments section, and enjoy our other videos.